Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I have a side bang. I've been wearing my hair like this sometimes, with these little spiky buns, because I think it's like very cute and very Y2K. So if you don't like it, hell bozo, I don't know what to tell you. But yes, the forehead is exposed, move past it. But today I am going to talk about the 5 Penguin classics I think are worth reading. There's a huge list. A huge, massive, huge list of over 3,000 Penguin classics, and a lot of them are really good, a lot of them are mediocre at best, and a lot of them are bad, and I'm just going to kind of like, I sifted through the list, I sat down, I did some research on my favorite ones that I've read, and I'm going to talk about them today, the top 5 that I think you should read. I'm also going to do a video of the top 5 that I think are not worth reading, or the top worst, some might say. I'm not going to talk about like the obvious players in this. I'm not going to talk about the works of William Shakespeare. Listen, if you're interested in literature, you should be reading Shakespeare, okay? I am not saying he's the most prolific writer of all time, though some might argue he is. I'm not saying that he's the best author on any of this list. I'm saying that he made a lot of changes in the English language, and he is one of the most important writers of all time, unfort, if you don't think so. But yeah, it's just like, he's an obvious player. He's important. If you study literature, you should be reading Shakespeare. That's just the way that is. I studied literature in university, as I've said before, and I didn't study any period close to William Shakespeare, but I had to take a Shakespeare course because he, you know, he paved the way, some might say. So I'm not going to talk about Shakespeare. You should be reading Shakespeare, girl. And I can do like a compilation of the best Shakespeare plays, in my opinion, if you want me to. The Taming of the Shrew and Much Ado About Nothing I like the comedies. What can I say? But yeah, that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the 5 Penguin classics that I think are worth reading. And yeah, it's just a little comprehensive list of like the Penguin classics I think are so great. Some of them are really famous and some of them aren't talked about nearly enough for whatever reason, because people are haters. But that's okay, because I'm a hater too. But not of the books on this list. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, the first novel is Territory of Light by Yuko Tsushima. It was published in 1979. She is Japanese, and is about a young woman whose husband has left her with her 2-year-old daughter, and she moves to Tokyo, and lives in an apartment. It takes place over the course of 1 year, and some scholars have compared it to Virginia Woolf, and it's like, I don't know if it's necessarily know if it's as harsh as Virginia Woolf is. It does like have a sort of like lightness to it. It's not necessarily happy, but it is a little bit different in tone. If you watch my first video, you know that I said I love Banana Yoshimoto's Kitchen, and I would say it has a similar energy to Banana Yoshimoto's Kitchen, but a little bit more flowery than Banana Yoshimoto's Kitchen. One of the things that I like revel Kitchen for is its minimalist style, and I think that Territory of Light is nothing like that. I think it's very flowery and it's very poetic and it's beautiful. It's just like an absolutely gorgeous novel, and I feel like I never hear anybody talk about it despite it really deserving its flowers. Also, I don't have a copy of any of these books. It's all stuff in America, unfortunately, and it's just too hard. I can't find copies of this stuff here. There are Penguin classics here, but it's mainly like Moby Dick and stuff. So I'm not finding Territory of Light, unfortunately. But I know Fumiko Komatani, which is like another Japanese author that's really like revered, said that Yuki Tsushima is one of the most important Japanese writers of her generation, and I cannot agree more. I think that this, even though she herself would not tout herself as a feminist, because there's a huge issue and controversy with feminism in a lot of Eastern Asian countries, it is a feminist novel in the Western idea that we have of feminism, and I think that it talks a lot about women's issues and what it means to be a woman, and what it means to be a single mother in Japan at the time. That's something I personally never would have understood outside of reading this novel. And I think it's also just like generally well written. Like, I learned so much about women's rights at the time in 1979 in Japan when I read this novel. But I also just read a good book. Like, it's also just a good book. It's just well written. The translation is really good. It was obviously originally published in Japanese, but yeah, I don't think you can tell, like, in the way the translation is. I'm pretty sure the translator also won an award. So it's just, yeah. It's really, I don't know if that's true. So please fact check me, because that could be wrong. But I feel like they did. Inconclusive. But I think that it deserves more recognition than it receives. So I think if you're looking for a Penguin classic to start with, I think you should start with Territory of Light by Tsushima. It's really good. It's really good. This next one I'm gonna be really passionate about. I think I mentioned that I wanted to be a Bronte scholar when I was in university, and I pivoted and studied Gothic literature instead, which is fine because I'm very passionate about Gothic literature. I love Gothic literature, so I don't feel like I wasted anything going into that instead of being a Bronte scholar. But I am a big Bronte fan. Specifically, I love Anne Bronte. Listen, I love her. She's a feminist icon. She's literally never done anything wrong in her life except for maybe some things, but she did die very young, so she didn't have the ability to do that much wrong. Except for the whole, like, but anyways, we're going to get into it. And I'm a bit of a Charlotte Bronte hater. And I also really like Emily Bronte. I think Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey are some of the greatest novels of all time. And those are the two novels I'm going to be talking about today. I'm first going to start with Wuthering Heights because I love Wuthering Heights. When I was in university, there was a scholar, and I cannot find the quote, but this is not my own quote. But there was a scholar who said that Wuthering Heights was like a fever dream. And it's gorgeous and in its sickness. And I could not agree with that more. And I wish I could find the quote so I could give them credit. But if you know the quote, please credit them in the comments, all of you that are watching this, obviously. But I do think that that's a great way to describe Wuthering Heights. I think that Wuthering Heights is one of the greatest novels of all time. I'm going to say that for every single one of these books. But I think that's something that the Bronte sisters, including Charlotte Bronte, unfortunately, do really well, is turning Gothic tropes into realism. Obviously, like, realism is like a big response to the Gothic period, because what realism does is strip back those fantastical elements and give you real life stories about real life people. But the Bronte sisters were raised on Gothic literature, and like they loved Lord Byron, and they had this like romanticism of life like kind of spinning in their heads. And I think that you can sense that in a lot of their works, and I think that you can sense that. It is there. They write Gothic stories with realism themes and realism scenery, and like the way that the world works in their novel is within realism descriptors, but they have Gothic heroines. And I think one thing that Wuthering Heights does so successfully is portraying abuse, which, like, if you don't know much about the Victorian period when it comes to literature, talking about taboo subjects such as being abused in your house, etc., is something that you just didn't do. This whole, like, angel in the house, women should stay at home stuff, like, post-Wollstonecraft feminism, it's just like you didn't talk about that kind of stuff, and it was never a conversation that even came up. I mean, you don't even have to look as far back as the Victorian period. You can look in the 1900s. Like, women were just not respected as human beings. Like, the Brontes had to publish under pen names when they published, male pen names. And Wuthering Heights does a really good job of portraying abuse and what it means to be a woman in a broken household and being in love and just being broken down. Nicolina Malagek said, unlike the earlier Gothic heroines, the female characters of Wuthering Heights embody the progressive elements of female Gothic. And I think that is really true. There are like a couple different kinds of tropes in Gothic literature. There's the fallen woman, so the woman who has fallen from grace, because like one thing that's really important in Gothic literature is like religious tropes. And so there's the fallen woman who has fallen from grace, and I think you can just already guess what that means. Like she has succumbed to her sins and she has now become demon-like. And one thing that the Bronte sisters really do is like work towards not being a fallen, like I guess like there is a term for it that I can't think of right now, but it's like they're no longer the fallen woman. And Matthew Lewis does it in The Monk as well, but there are characters who were like betrayed and were initially portrayed as the fallen woman that then themselves are modern female Gothic, and I think that Wuthering Heights does a really good job of that, but it has like a more realism feel to its scenery, and I think that makes it more successful than some female Gothics. Okay, that was a long rant. So now I'm going to try to casually talk about Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. She was the youngest of the Bronte sisters to die. That's a weird way to say that. She died youngest. She died the youngest. And so I feel like she doesn't really get her flowers as much as she deserves. Agnes Grey is about also kind of like a spinster. I don't know why all my novels are about spinsters, but she's like, anyways, she's supposed to be like really ugly. And one thing that I think Anne Bronte doesn't get enough credit for that Charlotte actually gets is she was like a true feminist. She was very anti-racist, which for the Victorian period, and especially amongst her sisters, was just not happening, girl. Like the Victorian period, I mean, it's England. In the 1800s, it was racist as hell in there. And Charlotte Bronte was really racist. You can see that within Jane Eyre. And a lot of Jane Eyre is like just really xenophobic. And a lot of people credit Charlotte. This is going to be, I guess I'm talking shit on Charlotte. I need to get back to Agnes Grey. But a lot of people credit Charlotte with feminism because she has that line in her novel where she says, our hearts are the same. But really, like, she was in love with her professor at the time. And some Bronte scholars will say that wasn't actually supposed to be like a big feminist line. It was actually more in reference to her wanting to be with her professor. So a little bit of tea, Charlotte Bronte tea. Her professor was married and wouldn't give her the time of day. But Agnes Grey is a feminist novel talking about women being more than their appearance and being more than love and being more than just a domestic partner and having more to do and think about and be involved in than just being a wife. So Asha Kaushik said she raised about Anne Bronte. She raised many issues about the grim condition of women, which either remain unnoticed earlier or her predecessors could not dare talk about them. Her dedication to women's rights and betterment and her distrust of men as superior gender led her to declare that women must look to defend their self-respect. She openly challenged the double standards that insisted for different rooms and yardsticks to judge and justify what was and was not proper and permissible in male and female write-ins and demanded equality. And I think that's very true for Anne Bronte specifically. I think that she was kind of, before she died, obviously, she was able to kind of break down the barriers of what it meant to be a feminist at the time and had inclusive talk, which was essentially unheard of, even amongst her sisters. Love Emily, love Wuthering Heights, but their talks about race and other people are not as inclusive as Anne's were. They just weren't. And I think that is something to be said. So I think that if you're going to read Penguin Classics, you should be reading Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey, and you should be skipping Jane Eyre, personally, in my opinion. Okay, the next novel I'm suggesting is super funny, lol. It's a satire. It's called Fortress Besieged by, I'm going to say this wrong, Shin Sao San. It was published in 1947. Also, the Bronte Sisters were published in 1847. But anyways, this was published in 1947. And it's about a man who, I guess kind of like escapes his hometown, but he lies about going to college, and then he has to come back to his town because he's been, like, stealing money from his family or whatever. And it's funny. Like, it's supposed to be a funny novel, but it's also, like, a lot of, like, social commentary of China at the time. And I think that, like, to be honest, I mean, maybe it's just amongst my circle, and where I'm from in the United States, but I don't feel like I hear a lot of people talking about, the Chinese authors within the Penguin classics. Besides like Chinese fairy tales and stuff, I think that there are a lot of really good, just like genuine authors who are writing, like satirical pieces, who are writing romances. I think all of that is in there, and they just don't get enough credit. Personally, I thought this novel was, like, hilarious. I think it's funny. I think it's worth a read. I'm keeping this too short, but I don't have anything much to say other than you just should read it, because it brings to light so many issues that I personally, I'm from America, so a lot of the media I consumed before I moved to Asia was America-centric. And so when I was reading this in America, it gave me a lot of perspective that I guess I just didn't see very much. And yeah, I think it's just a really good read. I think it's funny. I think it's snappy. I think it's not too dense. And I think it's a good kind of start into this, like, Chinese satire, like, as a genre. And Yongling Zhu, I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm so sorry, said it presents the light of head of female consciousness and the deep-rooted traces of male consciousness. And I think that that's true. I think that it does present men and women as just human beings that are living their lives. And there's no, like, there's political commentary, but not about women being inferior or men being better. It's more just they exist in one plane, which is in itself, like, pretty feminist for what was going on in China at the time. And I think that, yeah, I think it's just good. I don't know what else I need to say about that. I think you should read it, obviously. And last, but certainly not least, is Giovanni's Room by... And last, but certainly not least, is last but certainly not least is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. It was published in 1956. I'm sure you know James Baldwin, but there's a reason in not talking about Go Tell It to the Mountain or Notes of a Native Son, even though those are well regarded as his best novels, which I do think they deserve their flowers. Those are amazing novels, and I love them so much. I think James Baldwin in general is regarded as one of the best novelists and poets of all time. Maybe not in your circle, but for sure in my circle. He's regarded as such. I'm a huge James Baldwin fan. I think that he is prolific. I think the way he writes about homophobia, I think the way he talks about being a black queer person in America is something that I will never be able to fully grasp, but I can only try to consume in a way that helps me understand. And he doesn't, sugarcoat anything. He doesn't blanket anything. He just writes good literature. And I think that Giovanni's Room is talking about a gay man who lives in France, and like talks about like fetishization of black people and a lot of racism that comes along with homophobia. And it all takes place in this like one area, and it feels very tight and very close and very like claustrophobic, which I think is like the point of it. And Meg Westling said that it's an exploration of the damaging capacity of homophobia, and it demonstrates its central role in maintaining white supremacy and supporting U.S. nation building and French imperialism. The narrative unreliability of the protagonist, David, manifests the internal contradictions of the larger state project, which renders same-sex desire as both central to the national irrational order and unspeakable within the framework of imperial white masculinity. I think that is a really good way to summarize it, which is why I'm using that quote, because I think that like the foreigner, there's a foreigner in France, I think I already said that, and it talks about fetishization of black gay people, I guess, and it's just something that like, you know, I never would have understood outside of reading Giovanni's Room, and he brings up these kinds of points in a lot of his novels, but for this one, maybe because I read the others when I was younger, I was still a teenager, and I was a lot more of a blue-haired liberal than I am now, and then I was in university even. I was able to come into the novel with like a little bit, I guess, less, I don't know, a little bit more vulnerability and naivete, and it really like flipped me on my head, and it's just one of those novels that sticks with you. I feel like I think about Giovanni's Room like almost every day, so I do really just recommend it, just generally. Okay, that's it. Thanks so much for watching. If you got all the way through to this, thanks so much. Okay, bye. Wait, if you do want to watch the next one, I'm going to be talking about my 5 least favorite manga. I'm just going to talk about that, because I'm a hater, so I gotta be hating on the worst manga of all time, so yeah, so okay, now bye.